Welcome back to the final session. Across the front here, the strapline is Consumer Duty, a Brighter Future. And I think from the session that we've just heard, that was brilliant. There's some great stuff that hopefully is just assuage some concerns, some worries if people thought Consumer Duty was a mountain too big to climb, put it into some sort of perspective and answered some really good pertinent questions. So thank you to the previous panel. I'm delighted now to move us into a discussion around vulnerability and care and capacity and all things of that nature. And I'm delighted to be joined by, firstly, Jacqueline Berry from My Care Consultant and Tim Farmer from Comentis, two of the leading experts in knowledge, both of whom have contributed and worked with Air Group significantly over recent years on this subject matter. So I'm going to begin by turning to each of them to give us a sort of 5-10 minute insight into where the market currently sits in regards to their specialist subjects. What are the challenges? What are the issues that they see? How does that link into Consumer Duty? And then I've got some questions which I've got from both of them, which we're going to pose. And then hopefully if we've got a few minutes left at the end, we'll then put the microphones around for anybody who has questions, and then we'll finish for lunch. So if I may turn, Jacqueline, to you first of all, if you'd like to just give us your insights into the issues around care. I'm sure everybody in the room has been totally confused in the last few years. It's doing the okey cokey, I think, with the care market and the challenges that we face. We've heard multiple government proposals. So where are we today and what are the issues?
Yes, thank you, Stuart. Thanks for that warm welcome. It's great to be here today. What I'd like to do to start is hopefully provide a summary as to where we're at with the political side of care in respect of the care reforms. And I would not blame anyone in this room today for being slightly confused as to what has been agreed politically and the timeline for implementing those changes. So I'm sure we're all aware that the Boris Johnson administration in September last year announced the planned introduction of a new care cap for social care funding due to come in next October. Since the change in administration, we have now received confirmation on the 22nd of September that Liz Truss's government do plan to proceed with the cap as announced last September by Boris. Now, broadly speaking, what that entails is a cap on social care fees from next October of £86,000. As always, the devil is in the detail. So certainly for anybody that's self-funding their care from that point, they will need to engage their local authority to access an assessment of their need. And importantly, to translate that to how much the local authority deems their care cost to be. So the cost that contributes towards the cap is the amount the local authority deems the care to be, not necessarily the amount that the individual may be paying, in other words, a top-up fee. The second point to note is that the capital thresholds are changing. So we have a lower threshold of £14,250 and an upper threshold of £23,250. And those are both rising respectively to £20,000 lower and £100,000 upper. So in other words, anybody with more than £100,000 in capital will be deemed self-funder, and anyone with capital below the 20,000 and 100 will be potentially eligible for local authority support if they're deemed to have eligible needs. And that's the next sort of added layer of complexity that's added to the process. We also have the proposed trailblazers due to commence in January. So 6 local authorities have been identified to trial the new cap system, and that is planned to proceed as agreed in January. What I think we will see following the trailblazers, and this might be the sceptical side of my personality, but I think we possibly will see changes made to the care cap system or potentially a delay altogether. And I think government might use the trailblazers as a, I suppose, smoke screen to enable that to happen. Final point in terms of where this links sort of the care side of things with the debate around vulnerability and consumer duty. Certainly in the latest FCA vulnerability guidance, the FCA have made a huge emphasis on, customers in vulnerable circumstances having potentially additional needs and being at greater risk of harm, and they need to be identified. Linking that with the duty, which makes explicit reference to firms needing to pay attention to clients that potentially have characteristics of vulnerability. Well, anybody that has a care need, all their family members, in my view, are vulnerable. And we know there's increasing numbers of people needing care. We've seen a huge increasing issue in the rise of people juggling work and care in the UK post-pandemic. We've now got about 7 million people in that category. And of course, that will increase the likelihood that they will be in that vulnerable category. So I guess on a positive, it is the view of my care consultant that the changing requirements in respect of vulnerability and consumer duty actually presents an opportunity. And I picked up a recent quote from the executive director of the competition and consumer section of the FCA, Sheldon Mills, who commented on this very point and said, let's try and not see this as a mandate on firms. Let's see this as an opportunity to promote competition, to boost innovation and growth, and actually give us an opportunity for advisors to shift the dial in respect of going the extra mile and providing that important support to customers, certainly in the category of care or family members that are navigating care needs for their loved ones, because they are absolutely all vulnerable and need the support.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Tim, if I can move to you now, specifically on the subject of vulnerability. You and I have spoken in great detail over recent weeks and months how this is going to feed in, what work we still need to do as a sector. What are your views where we are right now?
So I think we need to start with a positive. And so we work across a lot of different industries. And one of the industries we've seen the most engagement with when it comes to, how do we tackle vulnerability, how do we identify and support our clients, is the equity release sector. And as as we work in the different industries, it really does feel that equity release is at the forefront, and you really kind of been some of the real kind of drivers for change and acceptance of this. And that's really, really positive to see. I think the difficulty is the complexity that sits around the vulnerability. I mean, the FCA have given us the 4 drivers. I like to talk them more as triggers. And everybody seems to kind of go, right, well, I understand, the health events and the life events, but the capability and resilience are much different. But even that, I think, belies the complexity, because the age group of 55 to end of life is the most changes in terms of life events, health events and cognition than at any stage in your development. And it's very easy, and what we see a lot is people have these tick box things at the front that say, is my client vulnerable? Yes, tick, okay, white, move on. And what we're seeing is that simplicity ends up causing more hurdles and difficulties further down the line. So I think there still needs to be a lot of work done around actually what's this initial identification, and that kind of what we talk about, the causative nexus. So what's the impact of that circumstance on the individual? And that's the really key bit that I think is the next stage that we need to be getting underneath of. In terms of the consumer duty, obviously there is that link, between the vulnerability and the consumer duty. We're doing a lot of work with a number of working industries across a number of different sectors, certainly in that consumer understanding outcomes. And unfortunately, one of the things I hear time and time again is, we communicate like this. That's where it stops. I've communicated the information, therefore my client understands. But actually, we know that's far more complex than that. Giving people information is not the same as being able to absorb it, apply it and understand it, which is what we really mean when we're talking about understanding. And I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done around that. Research tells us the average level of understanding in the UK sits somewhere between the ages of 9 and 11. And so actually, as David and Charlotte and John we're talking, providing that information is great, but we need to go that step further. And then how do we evaluate that they're actually understanding? And I think the MCA, the Mental Capacity Act, gives us a lot of steer on that. And we can take a lot of stuff from case law. So, for example, when we took, there's something called a threshold of understanding. So what does my client actually need to understand to make this decision? Where do we identify the level of risk? So the law tells us it's got to be foreseeable. It's got to be reasonable, foreseeable circumstances. So I think what we need to be doing the next level is how do we draw in this information from other sectors to apply it here to really kind of develop this out. I know people have talked about drawdowns, and one of the things we're doing as well is we're working with a number of different agencies within the sector looking specifically at drawdowns, really especially around mental capacity, because there's that, they applied for the equity release 10 years ago and we do all that stuff then, but now they rock up on the door, how do we know what's changed? And so there's a number of practical stuff we're doing with different elements, and part of me does think, how do we get this joined up thing around the industry? So we got all these different sectors talking about these different bits. How do we kind of pull it together? Because I believe there is a common will amongst everybody, to be getting the best outcomes, to be getting this right. And it's, I think that becomes the next stage. Let's start to have these more joined up discussions. And then finally, I suppose it's that end bit of, okay, we've identified, we know the causative nexus. Now what do we do? And how do we get that, again, that joined up thing around kind of supporting the client? And actually, I know this is one of the things that we've been talking about, isn't it? Getting this industry-wide kind of support framework that we can, work with you guys, give to the industry to say, right, when your client has this vulnerability, and we know it has this impact, well, this is what we do. So I think there's loads of really exciting stuff going on, and there seems to be a real drive in the industry to actually let's get the best outcomes for our clients.
Thank you, Tim. Before we go on to some of the questions that have been sent in previously, which I'm going to pose to each of you in turn, I'm just picking up something that Jacqueline said, and that was around as soon as somebody by default is looking at a care need, both themselves and their family are inherently automatically into that vulnerability tag. But if I can come back to you feeding that in, I've just made a couple of notes on things that you said as well. And vulnerability in our demographic that we deal with, I guess, is never or rarely a single line event. No. And we've heard many times about this sort of sandwich generation of the sort of 55, 65 age bracket that are caught between the challenges and worries of their children, who are young adults, and their parents who are in their 80s and 90s, and their challenges around healthcare and whether or not they have to go into a home facility or if something can be facilitated on a domiciliary basis. So just with regards to the audience that we deal with in equity release and later life lending, what are the particular ways that you feel advisors might be able to identify those things from transient to more fixed vulnerability? Are there sort of key things?
Have I got 2 hours? I think key to all of this is something that John was talking about, was training. And kind of the upskilling and making sure that the advisor fully understands everything. And then it's about having that robust identification process that says, right, this is my client, this is how I identify those key flags. That John was talking, having some of those flags in the fact find, how do we ensure that we identify those and then follow those through. I think if we're talking about that 55, 50 plus age group, for me, it's about understanding some of the core cognitive issues that sit there. So we know that actually those between the age of 55 and 64 are more likely to have a mental health problem than those that are 65 to 75. But then actually once you hit the 75, you're more likely to have a mental health problem than when you're at 50. We know that the cognition starts to go down. So at the age of 75, your processing speed is only 25% of that of a 25-year-old, and your memory is only 20% of that of an 18-year-old. So actually, how are we presenting that? And when we're having those engagements, how do we engage with our clients to be able to spot that and support them to do that? And the other thing I think for me is understanding that kind of whole concentration matrix. So the average concentration time at the moment is about 15 minutes, but that drops to 10 minutes when you're talking about finances. So again, when you're having that fact find, just be mindful of that, about how you structure, how you present the information to really be aware of that those cognitive differences as you go through those age brackets.
Great, thank you, Tim. That leads me very nicely now into the first question that's been asked. It's been said that later life lending market has begun the journey on vulnerability at a low level. but what should we now be doing to get better moving forward?
So absolutely, I think you guys are early adopters. I would say there's probably two things that it comes back to. One is absolutely that education, but I think we need that greater integration of identification tools and support networks into existing kind of systems and frameworks. It comes back to that joined up network. So I think they were the next two key things that need to be done.
Good, great, thank you, Tim. Jacqueline, if I can now come to you, there's a question that's come in here. Drawing out a key question in the consumer duty from the FCA, how can a firm ensure that their monitoring and oversight of outsourced or third-party service providers is effective, and I think that's probably underlined, and can be confident that these services meet the consumer duty, the consumer support standards?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stu. Just before I answer that, I just wanted to come back to a point you made actually earlier about the nature of people navigating care journeys on behalf of themselves or a family member. You know, inherently they're going to be vulnerable. I just wanted to expand on why that is. You know, the nature of making care decisions tends to be urgent. It might happen suddenly. So, for example, a family member might have a fall or maybe be admitted into hospital, and it escalates the need for care overnight in many scenarios. So, by the very nature of that scenario, the family is vulnerable, and anybody making decisions around care is vulnerable. And I think, linking to the question Stuart's just asked, the starting point in our view for firms that aren't already doing this is to simply let your clients know that you can help in this area, because the work that my care consultant does focuses on the non-regulated aspects of care planning. So care sourcing, benefit entitlements, navigating the very complex local authority and NHS processes. And that bit has to come before that regulatory piece, which is, okay, I'm going to be self-funding some or all of my care. I know that I am. I know how much that'll be. How best do I go about care funding? And I think letting your clients know that you can help across both those areas by, you know, conducting some targeted marketing. So identifying perhaps who in your client bank could be somebody that needs care or a younger family member is the starting point. And then bridging that with an embedded referral service that includes the monitoring of feedback from customers. The way we work at My Care Consultant is to share all advice documents with advisors. So once we've delivered advice to clients, we then share that with you. And you can then document what's been said, what's been advised, and that then feeds into suitability reports from your end, which helps de-risk the business as well. But I think as well, coming back to the consumer duty principles 3 and 4 on consumer understanding and consumer support, I mentioned this in my introduction. In my view, the way that the care reforms are combining with the regulatory focus around vulnerability and consumer duty, it is our view that in 2023, care advice is actually the biggest opportunity to shift the dial in respect of the support you're giving, and also to essentially make sure that you're helping customers understand all of the component parts of their care journeys, as well as how best do I pay for my care, and what is the best way or combination of ways to do that. And I think if you can put that in place, I think that's a really, really good start in respect of really sort of some quick wins in respect of meeting the regulators' requirements across those areas.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I have to say, just as a small anecdote, I know going back a few years when I was going through quite a challenging time with my own mum with regards to how the local authority was dealing with her situation. I know Jacqueline and My Care Consultant were a huge support. And I think it's very relevant here that when you're going through that as a family unit, it is an incredibly confusing period of time. And to have an organisation and a service that you offer links in with what we were talking about earlier on consumer duty, that this have a clear and concise handoff process, but don't just throw it over the wall and let the hand grenade go off in silence elsewhere. Make sure that it's followed up, make sure that it's recorded, make sure that there's a two-way communication to these third-party referrals, because that's what's going to deliver that outcome. That's what's going to link into when it comes to validation and value of your fee charging structures. That also has inherent value for consumers that may not be an element of the residential mortgage market. So when we get back to David's point around fee charging, then that's highly constructed within your long-term service proposition, but make sure you can A, evidence it, and B, actually do it. Tim, if I may come back to you, how can we ensure understanding in big capital letters from the clients is better? And this again loops back to a question that we heard on the panel earlier on. It's all very well giving them that 40-page suitability report just to say, hey, we've thrown it all down on a piece of paper, so that ticks a box. But how, when it comes to vulnerability, how can we actually ensure the client has understood better?
So here I think this is where we can draw some more stuff from the Mental Capacity Act and how we do things in practice there. So I think that the key thing is, rather than just giving everyone a whole stack of information, it's about, first of all, identifying what is it they actually need to know. So there's this thing called the threshold of understanding. So what do I need to really know to take out a drawdown mortgage as opposed to a different type of lending product? And so I think the first thing that the industry needs to do is kind of sit down and go, right, well, what is that threshold of understanding? What is it that my client actually needs to understand? Because only once you've got that can you then start to go, right, now we know what they need to understand. Now we can provide that information to them in a way that can help them understand it. And that's not just, it's about channels as well as kind of whether it's picture form or written form and that sort of stuff. And there's that whole combination. And once you've done that, I think it's only then you're able to go back and say, right, we know what they need to understand. We've given them the information in a way that they should be able to understand it. Now I go back and I double check whether they have understood it. And actually, again, with that, it's how do they then need to evidence that? And how do they present that to me? Does it have to be a verbal thing? Is it a written thing? Can they do it in picture form? And in really to be able to do that, you also need to then understand the impact of any vulnerable circumstances that might be going on in terms of communication, in terms of their ability to read, to write, to absorb information, the cognitive distresses, all that sort of thing. So I think we have to go right back to that basics of what do they need to understand? Let's break it down and then build up from there.
Great, thank you, Tim. I think that goes back actually to something I heard you speak at a seminar a few years ago, and I remember you talking about the transient nature of UTIs and how they can manifest as people losing capacity just by having the need for a simple set of antibiotics, but for a short period of time, whilst they have that UTI, it can manifest as extreme vulnerability and not being able to, if you like, repeat back as a sense check some of the things that you might have 5 minutes previously explained. So just having those awarenesses, I think, of the customer and tuning in is absolutely critical. I'm just going to finish off the question that came in because I think that leads nicely from what you were just saying. And then I'm going to come back to Jacqueline. Are there simple things an advisor can do now moving forward? There's a balance here. We can't expect advisors to become experts. I mean, you've specialised in this area, and Jacqueline, very, very similar. It's a fine balance between evidencing a robust belt and braces proper job and consumer understanding, but without becoming an expert, without, in essence, burying yourself in books and seminars and things specifically on issues around vulnerability for the next 5 years to get up to even a tenth of the knowledge that you've got, because that's all you've done for years. So what can advisors do that are at that simple level now that we can move forward?
So again, education has to sit at the bottom of that, but I think there are a number of tools out there. We've got our tool, for example, that is easily integrated into existing digital journeys and pathways that within a series of questions can identify, whether there's a vulnerability in the impact. So I think some of the simple things the advisor needs to be doing is looking out there and saying, what are the tools that are out there? How do I bring them in to my existing journey and use those appropriately? And I think for me, that would be probably the first thing I'd be saying is look at all the tools that are out there and think about how you can integrate those into your existing pathway to really move forward.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I think it would be fair to exclusively as well say to advisors that coming quite soon is a vulnerability guide, which we're working on very closely with Comentis and John Dunkley, who is our recently appointed chairman of the Air Academy. So we're going to have an industry available guide specifically on this subject that's written in straightforward language for brokers, how to deal with these challenges moving forward as businesses and robustly belt and braces evidence to the regulator that we are doing the right thing in the right way. Jacqueline, I want to come to you for the last formal question. And it's a nice way of rounding this session off. If there was one thing that you'd suggest the audience could do after they leave us today, what would it be?
Thanks for raising that. That's an interesting question. I just want to pick up on one point before I come to that, Stuart, if I may. And actually it's picking up on both what Stuart and Tim were saying about the need to ensure that customers understand the information and have digested it. Now, the problem when it comes to care is that a lot of consumers don't actually know what they don't know, and one needs to disturb them to make them realise actually the challenges that exist in the care sector. So let me give you some practical examples. The local authorities and the NHS hold the purse strings for the provision of social care and healthcare, yet they also are the decision makers around what care you get and how you can access that support. So for me, that there's an inherent conflict of interest there. And as a result, unfortunately, many consumers can find themselves asking questions of these services and maybe getting incorrect answers. That could be intentional, that may be accidental, but it's happening, and it's happening too often. So I think, again, linking that with the consumer duty cross-cutting rules around ensuring how you can ensure your customers avoid foreseeable harm and meet financial objectives. Again, it's making sure that regardless of whether you are positioning yourself as a care advice specialist or you have an advisor in-house, you will have many clients in your banks that you may already be aware of, but if you're not, they will be there. They could be family members of people that need care, and they will be walking blind into these scenarios. And actually, you can be letting them know that there is help available, whether that's in-house or working with a third-party specialist. So, coming back to your point, Stuart, around what practical advice I can give, if I can give 3 as opposed to 1 practical tip. The first thing I would say is for anybody that's not already signed up to the Financial Vulnerability Task Force, that's an independent body, which my technical director is actually sitting on the board of that. We were a founding member of that. I'd recommend that you all take a look at that. That independent body is all about raising standards and helping firms essentially adopt the right behaviours and support for customers in vulnerable circumstances. I'd also suggest, if anyone's coming to the PFS conference next month on the 4th of November, I think, my care consultant has a platform session and we'll be talking in more detail about the very topic around the opportunity that the combined regulatory focus and care reforms offers for all advisors, no matter whether you're specialising in care or not. And that is, you know, that opportunity is next year, and we think it's huge. And I think the third point, you mentioned a guide that the Later Life Academy, the AIR Group have produced. We've actually also produced a consumer duty guide that explains not just the link between consumer duty and vulnerability and the technical requirements from the regulator on firms, but also how that links practically with care and what you can be doing about it and what support is available. That launches next week. So if anyone wants a copy, please get in touch with us and I'd be happy to share that.
Fabulous. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Tim. Great. I think we've covered some great questions there and a good sort of overview. We could spend many hours going right down deep into this subject matter, but hopefully today that's given you a flavour and some relevant input and feedback. I'd like to throw the floor open if anybody's got any questions. We've got a couple of roving microphones, so is anybody? Richard.
Fantastic discussion again, thank you. Jacqueline, you mentioned the opportunity for care in 2023 and lots of talk of lots of collateral for support. Do you have anything, or could something be created that actually demonstrate the opportunity for firms engaging in that to be able to support customers, just so it's very clearly broken down?
Yeah.
Because I think we hear a lot of stuff, what great strides the industry has made, but I think care is just as it does in people's homes, remains a taboo subject amongst advisors. And I think demonstrating why it's important, to the commercial opportunity that sits within it would be something that a lot of firms, I think, would buy into if they had a better understanding.
Yeah, really good question. Thanks, Richard. And we do actually have a support resource called Carebox, which is focused on supporting financial advisors. And actually we have a popular consumer-facing guide to care. And I think that's a really useful guide for advisors to use to give to clients at the very first sign of identifying a care need. And actually, again, that feeds very neatly into the consumer duty requirements around helping customers understand and give them that extra support in specific areas. So I'd certainly say that CareBox could be supportive in meeting the need of the regulator in that space, and also as a first port of call to providing some initial information on this subject, even if it's not something you specialise in. So CareBox, and also, our team at My Care Consultant, we're openly available, 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, to support firms. If you want to give us a ring and talk about your business specifically, we do provide support in the area of, growing later life and care advice propositions. So get in touch.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I would add, actually, on air, on our download section, there is a webinar that we've previously done with Jacqueline that I think covers some of those areas really well. So feel free to share that, Richard. OK, there's a question at the back there. I think we've just got time for one more question.
In terms of demonstrating that a vulnerable client does understand, in many cases there's going to be a family member there also, a daughter or son. Get them to sign something. Yes, dad, mum does understand this. One thought there. Also, no problem recording a conversation to be absolutely sure that we've got something we could demonstrate to the regulator.
So I would urge caution about getting a third party to sign that somebody else understands, because what you're doing is you're just asking them their opinion as to whether they understand without actually getting evidence. And if there is any form of duress or kind of coercion, you're kind of feeding into that. So I'm not saying no, but I'd be saying I'd have some additional checks and balances against that. In terms of recording, I think generally that's a good thing. I know back in, I think it was 2012, one of the High Court judges said you should be recording, videoing all of your kind of assessments. A wider discussion, and not for now, does come, okay, if you're asking somebody that maybe lacks capacity, is it okay to record? Do they have the capacity to consent to being recorded? Which is another assessment within itself. So, there is a danger, though, that we suddenly find ourselves going down a, ever increasing number of smaller doors as we get there. But generally, I think recording is a good option.
Great, thank you. OK, once again, I'd finally like to thank Jacqueline from My Care Consultant, Tim from Comentis. I think that's been a really good, valuable session. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.